I hate Fire Emblem 7. This is something that I've brought up more and more frequently as of late. In fact, it's kind of become a bit of a meme on my channel, to the point where I will work in jokes about disliking Fire Emblem 7, even to unrelated videos. Despite its meme status within my community, my distaste for the Blazing Blade is very real. And from time to time, I get comments from people asking why I don't like the first English Fire Emblem. I've explained my distaste for the entry offhandedly in videos such as my series ranking or just in the commentary for Let's Play videos, but I haven't made a dedicated hate piece for FE7. And the more I mention disliking this game, the more requests I get for just such a video, both from FE7 haters and FE7 fans who want to know why I hate it. I resisted making this video for a while because I felt like it would be overly negative for basically no reason, but I've gotten comments asking about my distaste for the Blazing Blade so often that I feel like it would be nice to have a video to point them to if nothing else. Rest assured, if you like Fire Emblem 7, that's perfectly valid. Taste is subjective after all. There are plenty of games, TV shows, and movies that I enjoy that others would consider awful. Heck, on this very channel, I made a video propagandizing Fire Emblem Fates Revelations, and since then, it's only gone up in my opinion of it. So I guess consider this to be the dark opposite of that Revelations video. Instead of defending a much maligned game, I am insulting a beloved one. And what better place to start than by talking about its positive qualities? Despite popular opinion, I actually think Fire Emblem 7 has some of the better writing in the franchise. Not one of the better stories, but some of the better writing. I understand that the story has some CinemaSins-esque plot holes like Ephidel's incompetence or Nurgle's plan overall just being confusing, but ultimately I don't think that's necessarily a huge deal. These type of plot holes are present in every Fire Emblem game, and you don't even have to look particularly close for them. Like, a large portion of Three Houses' plot hinges on Dimitri believing that Edelgard killed his parents when she was 2 years old. In Thracia, Veld petrifies Avel just for fun, but doesn't do the same to Leaf, even though he also has Leaf captive and knows that Leaf is the biggest threat to his plans. Like, is the survival of Marquis Centauris long enough to pass on information to Eliwood really that much more of a stretch than Michalis being able to pass on information to Marth? Like, I know everyone focuses on these plot holes in FE7 because a large YouTuber made a 15-part series swearing about every single nitpick he could think of, but that same level of bad faith criticism could be applied to even the most beloved stories in the Fire Emblem franchise. But one thing that the Blazing Blade has in its favor is the trio of lovable lords. You see, one of the more severe limitations in early Fire Emblem writing is how the story would conflict with the ability for basically any character to die. Because Marth is the only blue unit guaranteed to be alive in every chapter, he can't really talk to Deke or Rutger about anything plot important. Instead, much of the narration is delivered through info dumps, either from people who are just joining your army or NPCs like Maedalis. And while modern games have escaped this pitfall by having certain characters just retreat when they died, such as your siblings in the Fates games or some of the royals in Engage, that can often feel like a cop-out to those who are invested in the permadeath identity of the series. Fire Emblem 7 instead chooses to have 3 separate lords, each of which is a game over condition, and all of whom have really well-established personalities. Lyn is the sole survivor of a genocide, and she's grappling with a lot of trauma from that event, combined with the new role that she finds herself in upon learning about her noble lineage. There's also a subplot about her dealing with racism within the Lycian League. I don't think it's done super well, but it adds to the depth of her characterization, and she's just 1/3 of the protagonists. As a sort of twisted reflection of Lyn, Hector is a character who also doesn't quite feel at home in the nobility, despite the fact that he has grown up his entire life surrounded by it. He's blunter and brasher than those around him would like him to be, lacking the patience for the sort of diplomatic language and customs of the court that his position demands. He's a man of action, born into a position that demands a man of words instead. But there's also more to him than just the guy who wants to smash faces instead of talk it out. Behind the machismo facade, Hector is actually extremely insecure. And the way that he and Lyn interact with each other leads to some really touching moments, which get to be a part of the main story because of these characters' lord status. In fact, let me pause to tell a story real quick, because I was gathering footage for the bows video and realized I didn't have any FE7 archer footage because, why would you use archers in FE7? So I edited a save file in FE Builder to give Rebecca capped stats including 15 move, and was capturing some footage of her running around pirate ships shooting people. For some reason, I decided to read the dialogue for this story instead of skipping it like I usually do. And there's a conversation between Lyn and Hector, at least in Hector mode, where Lyn talks about her discomfort working with pirates because all of the bandits killed her people when she was a little girl. Seeing his new friend vulnerable, Hector opens up and talks about his own traumatic experience with his parents dying, and how due to his position as a noble, he had to keep a strong face for the rest of the people of the kingdom. When he was eventually alone and able to cry, he found that he physically couldn't, because he had been so used to putting on a front. And I'm just sitting there thinking, holy shit, did a Game Boy Advance game just give one of the most nuanced portrayals of how toxic masculinity hurts men as well? Like, this single conversation touched upon not only why Hector refuses to stand on ceremony and instead is blunter than the other nobles, but also demonstrated why he hides his emotions behind hypermasculinity, and showed his willingness to break that mask if it'll help his friends. At the same time, it demonstrated the weight of Lyn's trauma and how it sticks with her even after all this time, and how that in turn informs who she is as an adult. And holy shit, the amount of emotional depth in this one scene of a fucking filler chapter is absurd. This is the sort of thing that most other Fire Emblems hide behind their support chains. But because of FE7's decision to put the three lords front and center, it gets to have this as a part of the main story. And if I'm being honest, this single conversation contains more emotional depth than the majority of the #hidden depth support conversations in the franchise. Now, in my opinion, Eliwood is definitely the least compelling of the three lords. There's a reason he didn't end up in Engage. He's kind of just a duplicate of Seliph / Marth / whatever other noble good lord you want to insert here. But even if he's not the most interesting character in the world, Eliwood serves a very important purpose towards the emotionality of the story. And that is that FE7 is a very personal tale. Technically, towards the end of the story, there are world-ending stakes with the Fire Dragon, but that's not really what Eliwood's quest is about. For the first half of the game, your main goal is simply to find Lord Elbert, Eliwood's father. You do uncover the Black Fang conspiracy and figure out that there is something larger at play, but the story stays grounded in Eliwood's desire to just have his dad back, as well as his insecurity about being the Lord of Foray, which gets elevated when his dad ultimately dies and Eliwood is required to take the throne. In fact, the structure of FE7's story is really well tailored to reflect Eliwood's mindset. The story begins like a normal Fire Emblem, fighting against bandits, and Eliwood is starting off on what he thinks will be a normal quest, trying to investigate his dad's disappearance. He detours to pick up Lyn, showing that he's not so single-minded as to disregard his friends, but at the same time is maintaining purpose towards finding his dad. The climax of both the gameplay and story is Dragon's Gate, where you defeat the antagonist that's dangling over our heads for a while, only to be introduced to a new one. At the same time, Eliwood accomplishes his long-term goal, rescuing his dad, only to have victory snatched away from him because his dad fucking dies. And then, in my opinion, fucking brilliantly, There are a series of random filler chapters as the group struggles to figure out what their next move is to defeat Nurgle. And it doesn't take a genius to see that this is meant to reflect Eliwood himself feeling completely lost in the absence of his father. How does he assume the role of leader of Foray? Where does he even go from here? It's awesome! This is so good! Upon gaining new purpose, you fight against the Black Fang, and there is an escalation of stakes as you learn about Nurgle attempting to open the portal to the Dragon Realm. But the real escalation of stakes is again personal for Eliwood, as he is directly responsible for Ninian's death. A character that Eliwood cares about a great deal and is potentially in a romantic relationship with at this point. And once again, at a low point where Eliwood is feeling lost emotionally, we are also lost in the story. What do we even do to fight back against Nurgle? And so we just have to defend against him before Eliwood gets a pep talk from Marcus and takes the fight to the Dread Isle, finally defeating his greatest foe once and for all. It's actually kind of ridiculous just how much both the gameplay and the story reflects Eliwood's emotional state throughout the course of events. It really helps the player get into the headspace of the protagonist. And it's not hard to see why so many people have an emotional attachment to this game's story, and especially its main characters. So yeah, despite the plot holes and the rather meandering nature of the story in general, I think Fire Emblem 7 actually has one of the better stories in the franchise. And yes, I recognize that that's a low bar, but even outside of the Fire Emblem franchise, I would say that the Blazing Sword story is quite good. So, you may be wondering, Danny, you just spent the past 10 minutes glazing Fire Emblem 7. Is this really a hit piece? Or have you secretly decided that FE7 is actually the S-tier best game in the franchise, and this is your redemption arc? And, well, I'm sorry to disappoint, dear viewer, but the story is basically the only thing about FE7 that I'm going to praise today. And while I do think that stories are important even in video games, I am first and foremost a gameplay gal, and the gameplay of FE7 is just the antithesis of fun to me. When people ask me why I don't like the Blazing Sword, the quick, snappy answer that I give is map design. While I don't think the map design is the only bad thing about FE7, I do think it's the worst element of its gameplay, so this seems like a good natural starting point. Much like with Fate's Revelations, the majority of maps in FE7 are gimmick maps. Personally, I don't think a gimmick map is inherently bad. I like a lot of maps in Revelations, in fact, and I think their gimmicks often add to the gameplay. The problem is that, at least in my opinion, the gimmicks in Fire Emblem 7 don't really add anything and are often instead subtractive. The ones that people point to most often are rain and snow, as they reduce all of your characters to having 2 or 3 movement. This doesn't really do anything for strategy, it just slows the game to a crawl. If I wanted to play a game with everyone having 2 or 3 movement, I would play Fire Emblem Heroes, because at least those maps are designed for low movement. FE7's weather maps are still the size of a normal GBA map. They just don't let you move through them at the pace that you should. But it's easy to point to rain and snow as a failed mechanic. And 2 bad maps in isolation don't sink an entire game. So let's take a look at the other gimmicks. The various magic seal maps simply turn off mages and other magical units. I'm all for making maps where certain classes are better or worse, but just making magical units completely non-functional feels like the lamest way of doing so. Battle Before Dawn is infamous because the whole rush to protect the green unit objective is very frustrating when combined with Fog of War and a lack of movement tools beyond mounts. A player without perfect knowledge can easily run into enemies in the fog, slowing them down and causing Zephiel to die. The Reavers map is at least a somewhat interesting gimmick. I think it's kind of cool to give every enemy a Reaver and shake up the weapon triangle. And despite being a defend map, there are actually a decent number of side objectives there, and you want to split your forces in an interesting way. A similar thing can be said about the Seize 3 Points map that is Hector mode exclusive, so credit where credit is due, there are 2 FE7 gimmick maps that I actually find enjoyable. But they are countered out by the especially egregious ones I already mentioned, as well as the category of just kind of lame gimmick maps. I don't know whether or not these qualify as a gimmick, but there are a lot of maps that seem to be built around only 1 or 2 enemy types. The third Kashuna map is full of only berserkers. The second Lin map is full of archers. And perhaps most infamously of all, Cog of Destiny is made up of almost entirely magical enemies. This one is particularly frustrating because in addition to being a very large route map with waves upon waves of tedious reinforcements, it is also a major switch up to how the game has been played up until now, and also how it will be played going forward. See, for the majority of FE7, resistance is something of a dump stat, with the few magical enemies that exist being trivialized by killing them on player phase or using a barrier or pure water. In Cog of Destiny, however, you really want a high resistance unit with access to 1-2 range who can fight the scarily dodgy Valkyries and the hard-hitting Druids. Well, at least the ones that don't have capped magic Luna, which is its own form of toxicity. Much like with the Magic Seal map, I think the idea was to give units that aren't good on other maps a place to shine. The high speed thresholds of Valkyries and the high res thresholds for all of the non-Luna mages are pretty nice to have, so units like Lyn and Isadora are significantly better on Cog of Destiny than the rest of the campaign. The problem is, I think this is just kind of a bad way to go about it. If the only map where a unit is worth using is one of the last ones in the game, training them up feels like a chore just to not have to deal with the frustration from COG. And for first-time players who don't know this is coming, they may not raise any res tanks, and then just end up screwed by the various status staffs and mages. But Oops All Mages isn't the only problem with Cog of Destiny. I don't like the Elliewood mode version of it either, which has a more standard enemy variety. The issue is that you have to route a giant map full of waves of enemies. It just feels really tedious. There is, at the very least, some amount of terrain to stop this from being a birthright map. There's a river and some mountains to navigate around, but in general, the solution to this, and many other maps, is just to plop a unit with a hand axe or tome into an area where they can fight a bunch of people on enemy phase, and I don't find that type of gameplay particularly interesting. And this often ends up being the best way to engage with FE7's maps. Although there are some that try to fight against this with side objectives. Here too, I think the game fails, as often these side objectives end up incredibly tight, to the degree that there is not flexibility in how to approach them. The two that most immediately come to mind are Whereabouts Unknown and Dragon's Gate, because they have the same problem. You have a clogged hallway that you need to fight your way through before a time-sensitive objective escapes. But because of the one-tile nature of these choke points, unless you are enemy facing with strong 1-2 range, you are not going to be able to punch through in time. Whereabouts Unknown is mostly archers, so without a hand axe or jav spammer, you are just kind of stuck in a traffic jam while you cry as the silver sword escapes, since Marcus needs to move full move on all but 1 turns in order to catch the thief before he pilfers the loot. Dragon's Gate is a similar story. You need to get someone to open doors and break walls through the 1 tile before Legault and the member card thief escape. Even when the game gives us side objectives, the best solution is just a paladin with 1-2 range. And if the depth of your strategy comes down to recognizing that Marcus's numbers are bigger than the other unit's numbers, I don't really think it's an engaging strategy game. But the map design is not the only area where FE7's gameplay falls short. I feel like the roster is also incredibly unfun to use. Despite the fact that the majority of the characters are very fun from a character perspective, they are just the opposite from a gameplay perspective. One of the joys of Fire Emblem is being able to pick your favorites and build an army out of them, and FE7 has a cast of so many lovable misfits that this feels like it would be the perfect environment for it. Yet everything about the game's design, especially on its highest difficulty, Hector Hard Mode, seems to work against this. FE7 is often considered to be on the easier end of Fire Emblem games, due to the lower enemy quality, at least for the average foot soldier. While I think its easiness is often overstated, it is worth bringing up because the way in which they accomplish having weaker enemies is simply by lowering their level. While lower enemy levels results in lower enemy stats, this also results in lower EXP gained through combat, because the EXP formula is dependent on your level versus the opponent's level. And to be clear, when I say the enemies in FE7 are a lower level than in other Fire Emblem games, I don't just mean a little bit lower. I mean, the final map of the game still features unpromoted enemies, when your squad is almost certainly made of entirely promoted units. As such, training your projects feels like a chore, and the payoff is often not worth it, because of the other trick FE7 likes to pull, and that is throwing incredibly strong pre-promoted units at you in the mid-game. The most obvious example of this is Pent, a sage so broken that he basically invalidates all of the other magical units in the game on his own. But units like Harken, Hawkeye, Geats, and Vida are also combat gods in their own right. And between them, your Dancer, and the game's Jake and Marcus, it can often feel like the majority of your squad is already picked out for you when you first start the game up. Now, FE7 is by no means the only Fire Emblem with a number of centralizing units. You need look no further than Har from Radiant Dawn, or Xander and Ryoma from the Fates trilogy, just to name a few. And I have completed almost every game in the series without touching its quote-unquote top tiers at least once. And even if you aren't going to such extremes, you can always use the broken pre-promotes alongside your favorite project units. There's no reason the Urk fans can't just have 2 sages on their team. But at least to me, it does feel really bad if you make training a unit difficult and the payoff for training them worse than the thing you get for free. Urk is going to gain EXP slower than any other early mage in the series, and at the same time, he is never going to be on Pent's level when Pent joins. Personally, I think if you go out of your way to train the projects, there should be some sort of payoff. And this doesn't even necessarily have to make the projects strictly better than the mid-game pre-promotes. Fire Emblem Engage has a similar problem to FE7, where EXP gain is slow and the mid-game pre-promotes are broken. However, due to the way its skill inheritance works, whomever you trained from the pre-Chapter 10 crew will have access to a number of powerful skills that the mid-game pre-promotes do not get immediate access to. Pandreo is probably statistically better than Klon and Celine, but they can both access Cantor, meaning that it is not a strict upgrade. There's a trade-off to be had. Now, obviously, in Game Boy Advance, it's a little bit more limited, so you can't have Cantor inheritance for Urk, which Pent misses out on, but maybe something like having Pent start with E-rank stabs, whereas a trained Urk would almost certainly have a higher rank than that at Pent's join time. Or give Urk a very high speed growth in comparison to Pent's bad base speed. Something to make him not just a strict upgrade over his pupil. Now, if you are a fan of both anima mages, there's nothing stopping you from just using both. However, in both Hector Hard Mode and Eliwood Hard Mode, there is a deployment slot cut, meaning that you have access to fewer deployable units than you would in the normal mode equivalents of the maps. In theory, I can understand what they were going for there. If you have fewer units to work with, then it is going to be more difficult to accomplish all of the objectives, especially if splitting your army up is highly encouraged. However, in practice, this just leads to a really unfun situation. If a map only has 7 deployment slots available, you're going to have to bench some number of units. Heck, even in the runs where I don't use the broken pre-promotes, I find myself benching some number of Skrunklies that I tried training up, just because there's not enough deployment slots for them. The slow EXP gain combined with the plethora of strong pre-promotes just makes training people in the early game feel unfun. And at least for me, when you don't have that training project long-term goal, the early maps are going to feel worse. Especially because so many of the units you get early on have just really shaky starts. Oswin and Marcus are incredibly strong, both short-term and long-term, but everyone else either feels bad initially or is bad for the majority of their existence. Dorcas and Bartray still manage to have hit issues despite the increased accuracy in the jump from FE6 to FE7. Despite probably being the best Cavalier if you're not playing Lin mode, Lowen just does not feel special at any point during the training arc. And Rebecca is an archer in an enemy phase heavy game. Need I say more? Matthew and Sarah are cool utility, but you don't really train your utility units, especially considering how slow Thief EXP and Staff EXP are. And Eliwood has a really mediocre start, not helped by the 2x effectiveness that his rapier suffers from. Now, 2x effectiveness is just a change made in the international version. I think the idea was to help out Western audiences who they perceived might not be familiar with how a strategy game like Fire Emblem works, so reducing the damage multiplier down to 2 times meant that, for example, your Pegasus Knights do not get one-shot by archers on their join map. But I actually think it affects player units much more than enemy ones. It means that Eliwood and Hector can't leverage their personal weapons to beat up horses and gain some EXP during that early game grind. And even though Rebecca and Will would be pretty bad units regardless, it is an extra insult to injury when both of them start on maps that have flyers, but are unable to one-shot them. That's like the job an archer has. Notably, Rebecca is a bit of a lost cause on this front, because even if you install 3 times effective damage, she doesn't one-shot the Pegasus Knights in her join map, but at least Will might have been salvageable. Although, speaking of Will, one of the other things that I think really makes the early game units feel bad is Lin mode. Lin mode is a 10-chapter long tutorial story that was included to help train people new to the franchise about how Fire Emblem mechanics work. It is extremely straightforward and, in my opinion, not very fun to play if you already know how to play Fire Emblem, simply due to how slow and easy all the maps are. There's no challenge, and yet everything still takes quite a while. The perfect combination of annoyance. However, all of the characters that you have in Lin mode maintain their levels going into the main campaign. And Kent, Sane, and Wallace each have an opportunity to promote as well, thanks to the promotion tutorial. Wallace is forced to promote the first time you play Lin mode, but on Lin hard mode you can ignore the tutorials and feed the Night Crest to one of your Cavaliers instead, which is generally considered to be optimal, especially since if you kill Wallace off, he joins as a promoted unit in Hector or Eliwood mode anyway. You see, all of the units available in Lin mode have 2 different bases available. One is their Lin mode bases, and the other one is their Eliwood and Hector mode bases. If a unit dies in Lin mode, or you simply skip Lin mode altogether, then they will join in the main campaign with their Eliwood or Hector mode bases. But if you play Lin mode and train one of the units in Lin mode, they will instead join with whatever stats they had after you trained them in Lin mode. I get what they were going for with this. It's kind of like a precursor to transfers from Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. But I feel like they were way too harsh with the Hector mode bases. Most of the people who join in Lin mode will be incredibly underleveled and understated if you don't play through Lin mode. They gain like 1 level each and not even one of every stat. This makes people like Kent, Sane, and Lucius just feel even more unfun to use than the rest of your early game scrubs. Since you're stuck with the dilemma of either playing through a tutorial that is not fun for anyone who knows how to play Fire Emblem, or skipping the tutorial and dealing with some of the most sauceless units in Game Boy Advance. So like, with the maps not being fun and the units not being fun, there's just not that much to the gameplay that I find enjoyable. Especially because, and I know this is controversial, but I think the Game Boy Advance engine is probably the weakest Fire Emblem has ever been. For the majority of its lifespan, the series has been very experimental. FEs 1 through 5 are all quite different from each other, and that includes one game that is a remake of another. Starting with FE 11 and moving onward, the games were once again all very experimental. 11 and 12 have the infinite reclassing and all the shenanigans that come with super powerful forges. Both Awakening and Fates technically have pair-up, but the way pair-up works in Fates and Awakening are so fundamentally different from each other that referring to them as the same system just feels wrong, and the same goes for those games' approaches to reclassing. Three Houses, of course, completely reinvented how Fire Emblem works, and Engage has the emblem rings, but despite being a remake, SOV also introduced a completely game-changing feature in combat arts. Even Tellius, which didn't exactly reinvent the wheel, had a bunch of minor tweaks, such as universal shoving and ledges in Radiant Dawn, as well as the Laguz units, who are completely different from anything we'd seen before or since. As compared to all of this, the Game Boy Advance trilogy is extremely tame. It takes rescue dropping from Thracia, tweaks it, and then strips away all of that game's other unique systems. The Sacred Stones did add a world map, a grinding location, and split promotions to varying degrees of success, but the only thing FE7 brings to the table, aside from the previously discussed annoying gimmicks, is the split story between Eliwood and Hector's perspective. In theory, I think this could actually work very well. As I mentioned in the story segment, this is a very personal story, and so naturally it makes sense to want to see things from the different main characters' perspectives. A perfect example of this is the conversations after Sands of Time. Eliwood gets a pep talk from Marcus, preparing him for his final confrontation against Nurgle. Meanwhile, Hector has to talk to Oswin about the fact that his brother Uther just died, and now it is Hector's time to assume leadership of the Lycian League, a task for which he does not feel ready. Despite the events being the same, the perspective elevates the story that much more. But, just like I said in the story section, the story of FE7 isn't the problem I have with it. I think its story is phenomenal. It's that the gameplay suffers. And unfortunately, at least in my opinion, the split paths just make the gameplay worse. The first chapter of Hector and Eliwood's story are completely different from each other. And while the second chapter of these two tales is the same, because Hector's party and Eliwood's party start far away from each other, as well as Hector mode giving you earlier access to Matthew and Sarah, it feels like a good choice from a gameplay perspective. But from there on out, the chapters in Hector's tale just follow step by step what the chapters in Eliwood's tale were, with the exception of adding a few new bonus chapters that are only available in Hector mode. However, because these chapters all take place during the time that Hector is in Eliwood's party, they have to be unimportant enough that their absence is not felt when playing through Eliwood's tale for the first time. And this leads to Hector's tale just having a plethora of filler maps. Talon's Alight is a random defend map that adds nothing to the story and also has unfun gameplay. Chapter 19XX is an optional map that is notoriously obnoxious to access thanks to the fact that you have to kill an extremely dodgy enemy in one turn. And what you're rewarded with for your trouble is just a lame Fog of War map. The Value of Life is a map that I mentioned during the gimmick section, because it just has a bunch of berserkers in a circular hallway. Nothing really that fun going on there. And probably the coolest Hector mode exclusive map is Crazed Beast. While this doesn't add anything from a story perspective, it does at least offer a unique objective, in having to seize 3 separate castles, all of which are at separate points on the map. It's similar to the 3 switches map from Lin mode, except for you don't have to capture the castles in a specific order, so you're encouraged to split your army up in order to quickly take all of the gates. But this map does have a secret, a dark secret that's going to tie into our next section, and that is that Chapter 25, Crazed Beasts, doesn't actually have a hard mode. So this is definitely the pettiest section of the video, and if these were the only problems with FE7, I wouldn't dislike it as much as I do, but it is worth noting that Fire Emblem 7 has a plethora of coding mistakes. And these aren't things like infinite pure water in FE1, or the double 100 dodge chance for FE6, but instead incredibly obvious oversights that should have been easily fixable if any amount of playtesting was done. Pale Flower of Darkness has a Myrmidon who only has a Horse Slayer in his inventory. Experienced players will know that the Horse Slayer is a lance, which Myrmidons cannot use. There's a route split that is determined by how much experience was given to your Guiding Ring users versus your Hero Crest users. However, instead of including Canas in the route split, Renault was factored in instead, despite the fact that Renault cannot be recruited until after the route split occurred. In a similar vein, which unit spawns on Kenneth's version of Pale Flower of Darkness is determined by how many pre-promotes you have killed. However, they forgot to add the Hector hard mode pre-promotes to this counter, and as a result, only killing pre-promotes who are present during the normal mode version of the map will count towards the counter. Multiple maps have ambush spawns, despite the fact that FE7 by and large does not feature that mechanic, seemingly as an accidental holdover from the way reinforcements worked in FE6. The game's ranking system is also very badly bugged. You're given ratings based on a number of different factors, but one of them is how many turns it takes you to clear each map. However, they accidentally forgot to program in the turn counts for many Hector exclusive maps, and as a result, they are marked as being cleared in 0 turns. Meaning that no matter how long you take, you will always score poorly on the turns portion of these maps. The AI of Wyverns also appears to be bugged on 2 very important maps, that being the Vida Defend map and Victory or Death, both of which simply result in all of the Wyverns on the map rushing for a random point. In Victory or Death, it's just the center of the map, and in Vida's Defend map, it's just a random-ass castle. One of the bosses of Battle Before Dawn, Maxine, was accidentally assigned double hard mode bonuses, and as a result has completely busted stats. And speaking of Battle Before Dawn, this isn't technically a glitch, but to my mind shows a lack of playtesting, as Nino faces a 3% crit rate from the enemy monk she is supposed to fight, and you have no way of reaching her before multiple rounds of combat have taken place, potentially resulting in her getting crit and dying. The same is true of Green Pent in the desert map, and in this case he's actually a game over condition. And these elements of randomness would be so easy to remove by simply increasing the base luck that the green units have. In Nino's case in particular, it seems like a completely level 0 solution. It's not like Nino is an incredibly powerful unit who would break the meta wide open if she just got 3 more points of luck. Now, Fire Emblem is no stranger to having situations that feel unplaytested. In fact, my personal conspiracy theory is that the majority of highest difficulty modes just do not get playtested. That's how we end up with stuff like the bosses in Shadow Dragon Heart 5. But I don't think any game is quite as egregious when it comes to obvious oversights as Fire Emblem 7, and I can't blame them for not playing Hector Hard Mode, because in order to play Hector Hard Mode, you have to play through FE7 at least 3 times, in the most bizarre decision. Like, I'm not a fan of locking difficulty behind complete playthroughs anyway, but I think it is especially silly in the case of FE7, where you need to play through Eliwood Normal mode to unlock both Eliwood Hard and Hector Normal, and then you need to play through Hector Normal in order to unlock Hector Hard mode. If you want to play on the highest difficulty, which in a game as easy as FE7, I think many people probably do, you need to play through the game 3 separate times, and one of those times has to include the slow, forced tutorial of Lyn Normal Mode. It's just excruciating. Yes, I love my homies like Canas and Rebecca as much as anyone else does, but I don't want to play through FE7 3 times just so I can bench Rebecca once again because I don't have enough deployment slots to fit both her and Pent on the squad. Next time I want to use Rebecca, I'll just ask Eat Your Greens to mod her into FE6 or something. That way I can play her in a good game. But see, here's the thing. Despite my raging hate boner for Fire Emblem 7, I really didn't want to make this video. It's satisfying for me to insult a game that I hate, but at the same time, despite my not understanding why, there are plenty of people who love this game. And I'm sure just as much as I enjoy tearing into it, they don't like hearing me insult it. The internet is plagued by rage bait, and in some way I can't help but feel like this itself falls into that category. Sure, I'm making it to explain why I don't like FE7, and it's something that people have asked me for, but at the same time, there are inevitably going to be some number of FE7 fans that click on and watch at least part of this video out of anger, a knee-jerk frustration at the fact that I don't like the thing that they love. But here's the thing about tastes when it comes to any form of art. They're subjective. I hate FE7, and I can rattle off a long list of reasons as to why, and how the reasons build upon each other to exacerbate the flaws. But this doesn't mean that I'm objectively right, because there's no such thing as objective taste. I do think it's valuable to examine why you like or dislike a work of art, and I personally find it fun to explain it, and there seems to be an audience for listening to me explain why I like or dislike at least a specific video game. But inevitably, when I make these more negative videos, especially about beloved titles like Bug Fables and FE7, there are going to be some number of people who take my critique of the game as a personal insult towards themselves. And I do feel the need to try and address that, if for no other reason than to justify to myself that this isn't purely rage bait. So firstly, if after all of this you still like FE7, then please go ahead and play it. Do not let me stop you. Life is short, one day we'll all be dead, so have fun with your comfort video game despite what a small YouTuber says about it. But at the same time, if you feel personally offended that I don't like Fire Emblem 7, you need to be able to separate the art you enjoy from yourself. Like, I get it, capitalism encourages us to make the products we consume a part of our identity, and I do it too. Fire Emblem is a big part of my personality, despite it just being a game series I enjoy. And this isn't a phenomena exclusive to gamers. We get Disney adults and the cult of the Stanley Cup and all that sort of stuff. But we as human beings are more than what we buy. I'm not just a Fire Emblem fan, there are plenty of other ways that I'm cringe as well. But you know who's not cringe? My patrons! So thank you to Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Adele, Thaythom, Andu, Reflect, YLO1, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, George Granville the 7th PM, Floahay, Gabe the Green, Controlled Aegis, Roman Kormanzik, Knick-Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Belwenska, Dysike, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Aerith Emblem, and especially my Jagans, Lilzabeth, Autumn Kelsey, and Julia Kyoto. If you would like to support the channel and gain access to early videos, polls that influence what topics I cover, and a couple of other benefits that are too spicy to talk about on YouTube, then there is a link to my Patreon below. But please only donate if you can afford to do so comfortably. I know this time of year can be expensive for a lot of people, so I don't want anyone to feel pressured. If you want to support the channel but don't have the funds to donate, liking, commenting, etc. are all really good ways to bolster in the algorithm. And speaking of comments, today's comment code word is BARD, so please include the word BARD in your comment if you made it to the end of the video, that way I know you watched all the way through. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.